Yo, what's up? It's Xander from Sides of the Sun here. Just want to give a quick thank you to everyone who's been streaming our new release. Sorry, it did about 55K in just over a month, so that's awesome. Couldn't have done it without you guys. Really appreciate everyone who's supporting it, adding it to playlists and all that good stuff. If you haven't heard it yet, there should be a link in the description. Follow us on Spotify, all that good stuff if you want to hear it. But yeah, today I wanted to just take you guys through what how we approach our masters. Now, we don't do a mix and master on all of our releases, but it's probably about 50% of them, anything that goes on SoundCloud, etc. Just depends if we want to work with our awesomely talented mixing engineer named Justin or not. So I wanted to show you Party Goes On. That's one of our older releases, but uses the same mastering chain and philosophy that we normally do. And it's basically about how to get it commercially loud and sounding like other tracks releasing in the genre. So obviously now we're making some more kind of like melodic tech and techno influenced stuff. This is more of kind of like a club tech house track. But again, the same things apply to all of them. Now, I'm not going to pretend to know or understand all the physics and biology behind how this works, but essentially what we're going to want to be focusing on is the perceived loudness of a track. Now, there's a couple different factors that go into that. One is how much of the frequency spectrum that you're covering. Another is the average loudness of the overall tracks, like the master. And then the last one is how much of the stereo spectrum you're covering. For whatever reason, all of those three different factors affect how your ears think of a song, of how loud it is, if that makes sense. Anyways. So that's all measured in perceived loudness, which is like RMS or LUFS, which is usually a negative number that is approaching zero. So zero would be like the absolute loudest that your ears could perceive. And it's always like negative from there. So the higher or the more negative a number, so like the higher its absolute value, if you remember back to like high school math, then the quieter the sound is. Okay, so the smaller number, like -3, is louder than -7. Okay. So yeah, that's the philosophy when it comes to mastering. Now, how do we actually implement that? Well, the first thing I'm going to recommend that you get, if you don't have it already, is some kind of referencing plugin. Now, we use this Metric AB plugin, which is really great. You can load in different reference tracks. So you see here, I've got Focus by Keep6 loaded in, as well as Like This by Truth and Lies. Now, if you click over to here, it should play. If we look at the playback, I've just got the kind of the drop loop. Here's Focus.
Stay focused.
And you can tell they're pretty similar to Party Goes On. So here's Party Goes On.
Party goes on and on, all night long. The party goes on.
And I've just picked to loop the part that has the most stuff going on. Now, normally, I actually do the mastering within the mixing project file. I wouldn't do it in a separate mastering project file like this, but having OBS run at the same time just absolutely murdered my computer. So I had to bounce the pre-master and do it in a separate file here. But yeah, this is a really cool tool because you can just flip between tracks to make sure that it's sounding on point, and you can pick whichever part you want to loop. You can set different loop points. Yeah, really sick. But beyond that, you can also see things like the EQ or frequency spectrum you're covering. You can see the stereo image. So we'll just play a bit here. And you can also see how loud you're getting. So this is kind of a dynamic comparison. So you can see Party Goes On is actually a bit louder than Focus. It's about on par with the Truth and Lies take. So those are the three components that I was mentioning, right? So the three things we want to be referencing, or that we want to be paying attention to get commercially loud music, can all be referenced within this plugin. So how do we get there? So we can see from, let's say, the Truth and Lies one.
Turn around and I make it jump like this.
We're going to ignore that little turnaround because that's going to affect, but the average, we're pretty much on point. If we look at the stereo wideness, we see that we're a bit too wide in the center and not wide enough at the extreme highs. which you can kind of hear with your ears as well if you pay attention to the hi-hats and Party Goes On. They're probably not wide enough. If you listen to the hi-hats in like this, they're super, super widened. So you do that in mixing, right? You can do that manually with the individual elements, but let's say you've got your mix finalized and you don't want to touch the mix. You just want to try to do what you can in mastering. We're going to approach it in a couple different ways. So you see here in my master chain, I've got 2 instances of Ozone 10. Now that doesn't need to be Ozone 10, it can be whatever you want. Split apart, Gullfoss in the middle, and then Metric AB. So I'll show you why I have it split up this way. In the first one, I'm doing multiband. They call it exciting, but it's essentially saturating. Now what this is doing is as the band gets higher, so that means as the frequency gets higher, there's more saturation happening. Now the reason for that is because saturation is basically like distortion. It's like a really mild form of distortion. High frequencies, for whatever reason, don't sound as bad as you saturate them or distort them compared to low frequencies. Now again, I don't know the biology or the physics behind why that is. It's just how it works. So you can get away with saturating higher frequencies more, which means that more of that frequency spectrum is going to be covered. And as I said at the start, the more frequency spectrum that is covered, the louder something is perceived as. So you're getting more juice essentially by having this multi-banded, because we don't want to make the low end sound bad, but we are getting more perceived loudness out of these higher bands. Then I'm doing the exact same thing, but with compression. So again, the same thing applies where the higher frequency, the more you can compress it and without it degrading in quality essentially. So what that allows you to do is actually create more headroom, right? Because the way that compression works, you are keeping the same average, which is what your perceived loudness is of a certain frequency range, but you're lowering the top value. So if this is the dynamic range of a sound, so how loud at its lowest point versus its highest point, when you compress, you're basically lowering the top and then shifting this up with makeup gain or whatever, which keeps the average loudness the same. So you're perceiving it as just as loud, but you've just gained that small amount of headroom. Now, the very high end, you're doing that more dramatically. The mid highs, you're doing it less. The mid lows, you're doing it even less. And then the sub, we're barely doing it at all. So we've just done 2 things now to increase the perceived loudness. 1, we've covered more of the frequency spectrum. 2, we've increased the amount of headroom that we have available for when we limit the sound later on. Now here's where I do I cut apart the ozones. I do this is just a dynamic EQ. So it's just detecting where it can duck and raise different frequencies. It's doing it with AI. Don't pretend to understand it. It's a great plugin, but again, I'm letting it do a lot of work in everything but the very low end. In this whole process, we just want to make sure that we're not degrading the quality of our sub and low end. So that's why I have this down here, so that this isn't getting messed up at all. It's only doing any of the magic in the mids and highs. So the final step, we've got our next instance of ozone here. And what we're going to focus on in this one is really just this maximizer. So this is going to be limiting it again at the end. And essentially, now that we've got all that extra headroom, we can just focus in on the low end and basically limit this until we hear distortion. So if we go a little bit lower, you hear that crackling. So we no longer hear the crackling. We no longer see that clipping there. And then I like to just flip down to IRC3, because IRC3, even when it does clip, it doesn't have that distortion sound on it. So you can kind of push it just slightly more, or if there's ever fills or something that have any low end that pushes it over the edge, you're still going to be covered. So once that has been done, then you can just unsolo the low end. And because we know the low end isn't distorting, the rest of the frequency spectrum should be fine. Now, if it sounds really distorted, you might just have the higher portions of the song too loud, but we know that just based off of how EQ curves work, right? If we look back at AB metric, we saw that generally speaking, at the spectrum, things have that kind of downward curve, right, on them. So we know that really the low end should be the thing that's mostly being compressed in the limiting stage, because we did that multiband compression already. The rest of it was already being compressed. It's already low down, so we don't need to worry about that being a limiting factor when we're in the limiter. So yeah, that's basically the philosophy, and doing that while referencing the loudness of your target tracks just lets you get that same commercial loudness. So that's kind of the philosophy there. If you need to keep tweaking things in songs that are perceived as louder, like a lot of the melodic stuff, the reason that they sound louder is just because you've got more high-end elements going on compared to a track like this, right, where it's more low-end focused. So they'll normally get to like 5.9 to 6.3-ish kind of range, whereas this was hanging more around 7, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. It's not too complicated. You do need to split things up a bit if you want to go the Gullfoss route, but if not, you can just keep them all in one instance of Ozone 7. It's basically those three key elements, which is multiband saturation, multiband compression, and then you're limiting at the end, and also stereo widening. So making sure that when you're mixing the song, you're keeping it as stereo as it gets up in the frequency spectrum. Yeah. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. More than happy to reply there, or discuss it in another video or something like that. But yeah, if you haven't already, please subscribe, like the video if it helped you out, and share it with anyone else who would benefit. Thanks, and have a good one.